everybody. My name is Randall Halle. I'm the director of the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh. And this is the last in our series investigating the EU enlargement that we've been conducting this year. It is 20 years on since the largest expansion of the EU took place. And we've been looking at various places. Today, our focus is going to be on Cyprus. I have two experts here, people who have also been eyewitnesses to historic transformations and authors, and I'll introduce them in a moment. First, I want to express my gratitude, as always, to Ingrid Gomez-O'Toole and Kathleen Brett, who help and assist and are here to make sure that we're on time and we're doing everything right. And without them, none of this would be taking place. I also want to note that that we have other activities in webinars, and that our series Conversations on Europe will also be coming to an end with our academic semester on April 9th. And we'll announce that also in the chat, but that will be on the European elections coming up. So if you're interested in that, please register for that. And these are all also recorded and online. So for those of you in the audience, you are welcome at any time to present questions, and I really encourage that. And you can do that through the Q&A, and we'll be attending to that. So let me begin by introducing first, Maria Hadjipavlou, who is an associate professor in the Department of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Cyprus. Maria is a feminist and conflict resolution scholar and practitioner, so she is an academic and also a person involved very much in the community and the conflict and the questions of Cyprus itself. She's founded and co-founded various NGOs and has been involved as a trainer for UN organizations working across the globe: Afghanistan, Tunisia, Turkey, Greece, Northern Ireland, and Bratislava, bringing her experience and expertise there, as well as publishing and doing the academic work for which we receive our credentials and our acknowledgements on many levels. Her book, Women and Change in Cyprus, Feminisms and Gender in Conflict, from 2010, is widely used in trying to understand various kinds of questions, including the questions that we're addressing today. I'll introduce our second person in a moment, but first, Maria, I'm wondering if you could open us up by talking to us a little bit about this background and the experience and your relationship. You were born in Cyprus, and you've been firsthand experiencing many of the transitions that Cyprus has gone through. Could you say a few words to situate yourself?
Yeah, just very briefly to tell you, I'm retired associate professor. So now I have more space to do my activist work as well, and writing without being self-censored at times.
But I'm sure the students are going to miss you. So
no, many of them are still, around my space. But yes, what I became, actually, my story of education is like the Cyprus problem. It went in these different phases, because in the late 60s, when I went for my first degree in England, I studied English literature, and my dream was to teach Shakespeare from the original. I loved Shakespeare since I was in school, because through those texts that we were given, I became very interested in understanding the human condition. So this was one of the focal, in a way, points in my life throughout to this day. How do we understand what we call the human condition in all its diversity, and also in all its manifestations. I did a master's in England as well, and then 74 discontinued my next step, which was to do a PhD. So I came back. I felt that Cyprus needed me. I also had a guilt.
Because that was the year of partition, right?
Yes. And I couldn't believe that, because all the things I believed in were really badly attacked. And also, not only that, but I somehow inside me, I felt it's not possible that these things happened. You know, although I knew of the junta in Greece, I knew that an imminent coup d'etat was going to take place. But the division as it happened in this way, I was not prepared to accept and wanted to understand. So when I came back, I became very political. I was already political, but this is how the next phase of my education, going to the United States, getting involved in conflict resolution, and especially trying to understand the root causes of ethno-national conflicts, like the Cyprus one. And then the other part was, what is the missing link in our analysis? And that was the gendered aspect of the ethno-national conflicts, not only in Cyprus, but all over, you know, the world. So that is how I am today here and continuing that kind of work.
Well,
Yeah.
I appreciate that, and I'm glad that you're here, and we'll continue our conversation. But let me introduce James Ker-Lindsay, who is a professor at the London School of Economics and the European Institute. His research focuses on conflict, peace, and security in Southeast Europe, the Western Balkans, Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus. He has worked on precisely these questions of European enlargement and succession and recognition in international politics. He has been an active leader in these areas of research, a coordinator or former coordinator of the British International Studies Association working group on the region, and has been very actively involved in publishing, bringing people together, bringing scholars and activists together. And indeed, one of the places of interaction between you, James, and Maria was in the collection, the very interesting and very good collection that you did, Resolving Cyprus, New Approaches to Conflict Resolution. And really a very, really have had a chance to look through it and see the breadth of people that you brought together there. But you did not grow up on Cyprus. Can you talk a little bit about, or am I wrong about that? Can you talk to us a little bit about your relationship and how you came to be the person? When I asked other people who should I contact, they said James. So that was something very impressive to me. Yeah.
Well, look, first of all, can I say a huge thank you for the very kind invite to be on the panel, and how lovely it is also to be joining Maria, who I've known for many years. And, you know, I think she was very modest, but she really has been a leading light of efforts by communal activity in Cyprus for many, many decades. And you know, it's wonderful to to be here sharing a panel with her and listening to what she's got to say. Yeah, my background, yes, was a bit different, as you can probably tell. I'm not from Cyprus originally, although I sort of do think of myself now. You know, it's been 35 years that I've been involved with Cyprus. Now, I was about 18, and my late father had a Cypriot business partner. And so that was in the day when Cyprus wasn't a member of the European Union. It had what was called the offshore business sector. So it was after the invasion in 74. One of the things it did to rebuild the economy was to say, look, we're in a great strategic position. We've got a really well-educated workforce here. English is very widely spoken. The accounting and legal system are based on British law. and a good court system. So it really made the most of a bad situation and said, look, businesses, come to Cyprus, we'll give you a very beneficial tax rate, and you can do all sorts of business around the world. And so Cyprus really, really took that opportunity to rebuild itself. And so my father moved my family out here, and I was, as I say, 18. Okay. And from the start, I just fell in love with Cyprus. I was fascinated by the place, and as somebody who was working on politics and international relations, I just became completely immersed in the Cyprus problem, and then went on from there. So did a master's degree in conflict analysis, then wrote my PhD on the origins of the UN peacekeeping force, which is just about 3 weeks ago marked its 60th anniversary on the island. So, which was a bizarre thing. I'm in my early 50s now. I was writing about event that took place about 8 or 9 years before I was born, and here we are marking this 60th anniversary of something which sort of really shows its longevity. And since then, just remained very, very active working on Cyprus. So published a lot on it, but also from a policy point of view. So I actually ended up sort of working for the British government at the Foreign Office on Cyprus settlement efforts, and was involved in, as part of the British team in 2016, 2017 at the talks in Crans-Montana. So I sort of crossed that boundary from academic to policymaker, but also with a very personal experience. I'm actually living back in Cyprus. I came back about 6-7 months ago.
Wow.
Very good.
Welcome.
So let me just say a few things that you can correct me. Both of you, please, I welcome your corrections. But one of the things that's interesting for us to consider in this history of enlargement is that largely we're discussing Eastern European enlargement that takes place after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Cyprus and Malta are the exceptions in some way in this larger field of enlargement. And Cyprus is particularly interesting for us to consider in some ways, in that if you look geographically, Nicosia is closer to Beirut than to Athens, and closer to Tehran than Brussels. And yet, James, you're already sort of alluding to something of a European orientation, why Europe makes sense. But we can recall also that this moment of accession to the EU was bound up with the hopes of conflict resolution. Kofi Annan, then head of the United Nations, had put forward a plan in which there would be a process that would move things forward in Cyprus, and accession to the EU would in effect make the border that is drawn between North and South, North and the Republic, superfluous in some ways, and that didn't happen. Could you correct me or help us understand a little bit better what exactly was the situation, how that unfolded at that particular moment? Maria, maybe we could start with you.
Okay. I think it's very interesting that you brought in geography, for me, because geography has also been one of the contested issues in our Cypriot conversations often. Where does Cyprus lie? And who does Cyprus belong to? That has also been questions throughout our history. Is it in the Middle East? Is it at the crossroads of 3 continents? And is it Turkish later? Is it Greek? So the issues of geography and identity have always also been very part of what can explain later a lot of the rootedness of this conflict in Cyprus. And entering the European Union also developed another aspect of identity, okay? So now I think most people are more comfortable with their Greekness and Turkishness, I think, because we have the European kind of identity that can join us, that can act as a kind of a civic unifying kind of space for us. I did a little research, very recently on what does the European Union mean to the Turkish Cypriots, that usually we hear, the Greek Cypriot side, but not. So it was interesting to hear their view. But with regard to what you also said about the deadlock and about all these failed attempts, yes, the Annan plan, in my view, was a big opportunity. However, different factors did not make it happen. And there have been a lot of analysis, of the different no's in the Greek Cypriot community and the different yeses in the Greek Cypriot community, as well as in the Turkish Cypriot community. So a big opportunity for us, and in my view, you can understand, I was a supportive of the yes vote, was the first time after so many years that a space opened up through this plan for working together and for putting into practice many of the things that we conflict resolution people believed in. Number one. Second, I think the international environment was very conducive at those times. Turkey came to support it. The EU, the Americans, UK, international organization, the World Bank, etc. So there was a cluster of institutions that were very supportive. So we missed that a lot. And I think the repercussions of that, they're still lingering on, even when we went to Crans-Montana, okay? We can discuss the other aspect of the leadership. What kind of what role does the leadership play in situations like this? And why, we got stuck.
But maybe we'll come to that question. I want to talk about the kind of leadership and democracy and how the Republic and how the northern part works. But maybe James, so interestingly, it just occurs to me that we are talking then about 2004 as also 30 years since partition. So in those 60 years, it was a halfway point. And I'm wondering if you could take us a little bit further in understanding that particular moment and what went wrong or what went right at that particular moment.
Yeah, obviously, as you can imagine, the Cyprus problem is a huge subject, and we'll be here all night to try and sort of go into real detail about it. But essentially, yes. Cyprus became independent in 1960. It had this unusual constitution, which was power sharing between the Greek Cypriots, who were almost 80% of the population, and the Turkish Cypriots, who were almost 20%. You've got three small religious communities, which make up about 4%. And this didn't last very long. It collapsed in 1964, and hence the origins of the UN peacekeeping force that we're now seeing. And then you had 1974, which was a coming together of different factors. You had a military regime in Greece that wanted to unite Cyprus with the rest of Greece. That was rejected by Turkey. Turkey invaded. You had the partition. And then you had a series of efforts to try and reunite Cyprus. And there was an agreed formula that it would come together as a federal settlement, what we call a bizonal bicommunal federation. So a federation that would be made up of two parts and two communities, essentially mapping onto each other. So you'd have one of the federal states, which would be, and this is a big dispute between Greek and Turkish Cypriots, one that would be predominantly Greek Cypriot and the other one predominantly Turkish Cypriot. So these talks went on for a very long time. They didn't go anywhere for all sorts of reasons, but largely because you had a particularly intransigent Turkish Cypriot leader called Rauf Denktaş. Very interesting character when we talk about leadership in Cyprus. But then you had the breakdown of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and that completely changed the political geography of Europe, of course. That the old Iron Curtain fell, and there was a real sense that now was the opportunity for the European Union to enlarge. And as you've been talking about, that was about taking in the states, the former, communist states of Eastern Europe. But of course, you then had these two other outliers, which were Malta and Cyprus. You actually had a third one, Slovenia, which was a bit different because it'd been part of Yugoslavia, which wasn't technically part of the Soviet bloc. But nevertheless, let's just park that debate. I'm sure you've covered it. But you had Cyprus and Malta, and Cyprus wanted to join. And of course, this division was a very problematic issue. There were many countries in Europe which felt very nervous about the implications of taking in a divided Cyprus. On the other hand, there was an important principle at play. The argument was, and this was upheld by many in the European Union and the United Nations, that Cyprus was not divided because the Greek Cypriots, the Republic of Cyprus, wanted it to be divided. And because Turkey was saying, no, you can't take Cyprus in, it would have set a very dangerous precedent for the European Union to block Cyprus joining. Because remember, of course, you had Russia saying to the Baltic states, well, we have an interest in these. So the European Union didn't want to set the precedent that any third state has the right to veto who can and can't join. Nevertheless, Cyprus, many were nervous about taking in the divided island. And what I often say, and I think is quite important in all of this, is that in many ways, Cyprus was the politically most difficult of the countries that joined in 2004 because of this division, because it meant, a potential showdown with Turkey, which of course was also a candidate for membership and is a candidate. But technically, Cyprus was by far the easiest country. I remember speaking with the EU negotiator who was dealing with Cyprus, who said his job was a dream. Cyprus did a very, very clever thing when it started the process of accession, is it appointed the former president, George Vasiliou, to be the chief negotiator.
Interesting.
Who many would probably regard as technically the best president that Cyprus had. He only served one term, 5-year term. And he really understood the EU, and he said, look, it's a matter of national priority that we join the European Union. So I'm not going to create any unnecessary obstacles. So as many of the students will know, we use this term EU accession negotiations, but it's a misnomer. It's not really negotiating. Essentially, the European Union says to countries that want to join, if you want to join, here's the rule book. Swallow it, implement it, and you can get in. And there is room on the margins for little bits of negotiation. So, for example, if you've got one particular sensitive industry which might not withstand a sudden opening up to the European market, you can get a derogation. You can get an exception, maybe for 5-10 years. Very, very rarely does the EU give a permanent derogation. And whereas what was happening is with Poland, I remember this negotiator would say to me that his Polish counterpart would go to Warsaw for the meeting, and he'd have to sit through 3 or 4 hours of the Polish team saying, we can't do this, you've got to understand this. And he just, at the end of it, have to say to him, I'm sorry, you've got to do this. This is how you join the European Union. The Cypriot one said that never happened at all. That they went in, it was a really clear, simple process. Cyprus was by far the most advanced of the members. Legally, it didn't throw up any problem. It wasn't post-communist at all. It had a very good administrative system. So in that sense, it was a fascinating process that you were dealing with this political complexity of the island's division, but at the same time, you were dealing with a country that was far and away the most advanced of those that was lining up. And so it then became very difficult for the other countries to say, well, look, it's not ready in the way that Bulgaria or Romania, for example, had to be pushed into the waiting room for a few more years. So sorry for a bit of a long answer on that, but hopefully that provides a little bit more context. And of course, then you had the Annan plan that Maria had just discussed. And the European Union certainly, and we can maybe talk about this in a bit more detail, felt terribly let down because they felt the return to the deal of accepting Cyprus to join the European Union, despite the division, was that if a credible plan was put on the table, the Cypriots would accept it. And of course, that didn't happen. And it caused a lot of rancor, a lot of unhappiness in EU circles, which in many ways, many senior people like Gunther Verheugen, who was the EU Enlargement Commissioner at the time, openly saying he felt betrayed by the Cypriot government, by the Greek Cypriots, because they'd taken a risk on taking Cyprus in on the basis that EU enlargement was going to provide this catalyst for a settlement, and it didn't work that way. So Cyprus entered the EU actually under a cloud, unfortunately, despite all the good work that had gone before.
But that's interesting, and indeed, it might be important to distinguish Greek Cypriot, Northern Cyprus, the Republic of Cyprus, and understand. Interestingly, then the implication here now is that the Republic of Cyprus is an EU member and has a veto right. And so that means that Northern Cyprus, that means that Turkey, that means that all of the other countries in the Mediterranean who might aspire or be interested, or in the Balkans, need to pass by the Cypriot veto right, and that has made the situation more complex after that took place. Can I ask though, and it's interesting, the process of accession that you're describing entails these opening up of the briefs and the acquis, and so as you described, you have no choice. You have to the harmonization of the legal system that is part of it, or the harmonization of the economy. What you've already said, James, suggests that was fairly easy, given the existing structure, sort of British law as a foundation there. But part of it is also the question of human rights and the agenda, the values that is, and kind of cultural questions. And there, Maria, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that particular process, and do you agree with James? And from your perspective, was the Republic indeed in line with freedom of the press and all the other requirements, democratic requirements, as it were, liberal democratic requirements that were part of that process?
I think comparatively, yes. I mean, James really, put it in context vis-a-vis all the other candidates at that time. And I think, yes, on the whole, we can say that we were in a much sort of, better position, although things, needed to be done as well. In certain areas, especially the harmonization of many of our laws, and the issues also of issues of discrimination, or issues, of rights of minorities and other social groups, etc. But on the whole, it's not only Verheugen or the EU or the UN that were felt betrayed, or in quotes cheated, but also the Turkish Cypriots, who had really prepared the community for the accession and for entering this union. And their biggest, of course, wish and desire was to disengage from Turkey and to gradually, become part of this family and of a reunited Cyprus, looking forward to new opportunities and development, but most importantly, embracing the European values, of collaboration, of working together, and of sharing a vision of a different Cyprus. So I felt betrayed as well. And many of my Turkish Cypriot friends, who for decades we did peace building work across the divide, they wouldn't talk to me, because their neighbors who voted yes, and so the result in the Greek Cypriot community, they started attacking them. Is this the people you want to live with? Is this the people you want to share? So at the civil society level, there was also a very big upset, mistrust, polarization, which took many years to restore. You know, it wasn't easy either. So, and this backlash, you know, this backlash really stayed on with us for a long time, although we had in 2003 the opening of the checkpoints and people could cross to and fro, which was another opportunity that I think the peace process at the macro level did not really utilize or take into consideration the people's movements and desire from below. So yes, I fully agree. And the other thing, when we started harmonizing our laws, I was a number of times in the House of Parliament watching, you know, the process and so on. And I asked some of the members of Parliament whether after these laws are approved and so on, what's the next step? Would they go out and inform the communities what these changes entail for their daily life, for their rights, for their opportunities, and so on? And they looked at me and they said, we haven't thought about this. And of course, it was always, you know, this top-down
abstract
process. So there was no transparency either to this day.
So interestingly, I want to ask us to just, for those who are not as clear on what the yes vote means, Canan Baltar in our question and answer is saying thank you, Maria, for also representing well the Turkish Cypriot side. He's saying that he's a Turkish academic who worked for Yes on the Turkish Cypriot side and worked with Mustafa Akıncı and others, and really remembers that moment. But we're talking about a yes vote that had to simultaneously take place in both communities. Or James, do you want to extend that, or do you want to remind us of what the yes vote's capacities were here, how that worked out?
Yeah, so I mean, again, a little bit of history on this. So the EU took this decision; it was going to take Cyprus in. And the idea was that it would be a catalyst for a settlement. And that's not really what happened at first. So this legendary Turkish Cypriot leader, Rauf Denktaş, that I'd mentioned, who was notoriously obstructive, said, no, if Cyprus is taken in, then we in the north, which had declared independence in 1983, we will integrate step for step with Turkey. So every step that Cyprus takes to join the European Union, we'll do the same with Turkey. And so it became a battle of wits between Ankara and the European Union. And essentially, it became clear to Turkey that the European Union wasn't going to back down. It wasn't going to allow Turkey to have a veto over it. And so Denktaş then said, right, okay, my original plan isn't working. What my second plan is, I'll enter into negotiations on the basis that if we're negotiating, then the EU might not want to upset those delicate negotiations by taking Cyprus in. So it was all a strategic ploy to, again, delay that process, and it didn't work. And what actually happened is the closer and closer that Cyprus got to joining, the more and more that ordinary Turkish Cypriots said, we want to reunite. We want to be part of this European project. We don't want to be left in this isolation anymore, because after Turkish Cypriot leadership declared independence in 1983, there's UN resolution saying this is illegal. There's an embargo on the north that has really isolated them, and they were fed up with it. And so Denktaş was maneuvered aside also by the fact that you had a radical change of government in Turkey at the same. So Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who we now look at as this very authoritarian, leader who stands against European values in many ways, when he first came to power, was seen as this modernizing figure, this radical figure who, came in and said, look, I want, my priority is to get Turkey into the European Union. This is the way that I'm going to reform the country. I'm going to open it up, make it more open to religious sentiment. And to do that, I have to solve Cyprus. So you suddenly had this Turkish government that wanted to get a settlement. So Denktaş, this hardliner, was sidelined, and it looked full steam ahead until the Greek Cypriots then elected a hardliner of their own. Right. So after all these decades of trying to ease things up on the Turkish Cypriot side, you suddenly had this Greek Cypriot leader who rejected a UN plan that was put on the table. And so the UN tried to bypass him and essentially said, look, we'll fill in the gaps and we'll put it to a referendum. And that took place exactly a week before Cyprus joined the European Union on the 1st of May 2004. And I was living here, and like Maria, I mean, it was a very traumatic event. And as she said, you're lucky in the United States you don't have national referendums, because I can tell you, having been here for the Cyprus referendum in 2004 and having been in Britain for the 2016 Brexit referendum, these are divisions that don't heal easily. You bear these scars, and even today, in some way or another, it can still be felt. But essentially, it went to a vote, and you had 2/3 of Turkish Cypriots say, yes, we want to reunite according to this UN plan. But within the Greek Cypriot community, 3/4 voted no. I mean, that is an overwhelming no. And that was partly because you only had one of the big parties that really overtly came out and said, vote yes. The other party, the big party at the time still is the Communist Party, AKEL, which has traditionally been pro-settlement, but for reasons only known unto itself, it decided to essentially abstain on it. And it was a historic mistake in many people's minds. And so you had this overwhelming no vote. Cyprus entered, as I say, under a cloud, and there was a lot of ill feeling. But as Maria said, it was those Greek Cypriots who voted yes felt let down. Turkish Cypriots felt let down. Turkey felt let down because it said, look, we made this move now after all these years. And, that's having a bearing even on what we're seeing today, but also the European Union and the other members. So it was a very, very traumatic time, when we saw that, because suddenly there was this feeling that after all these decades, we were on the verge of a Cyprus settlement, and it disappeared. And people were saying, well, if we vote now, in a few months' time, once we're in the European Union, we'll get a much better deal. And of course, that didn't happen. We're now marking 20 years of Cyprus being in the European Union. We had only one more serious go at trying to get a settlement, and that was in 2017. And unfortunately, that didn't get anywhere either.
Right. I mean, it seems as if it's a little bit frozen at the moment. It's interesting, and also the transformations in Turkish politics. And I appreciate what you're reminding us of, because in the initial phase, Erdogan was certainly making strides towards Turkish entry into the EU from the Turkish side, that we need to remember, recall, respect, and understand much of the sort of the resistance to Turkish entry into the EU came from France, from Germany, and the process of drifting away from accession to the EU is as much the one side as the other to be investigated. I don't want to say blame, but from a Western European, Northern European perspective, it's often the Turks who are the problem, as opposed to. I appreciate you're both helping us understand the complexity of this particular moment.
There are so many things. Please. Because James already mentioned it, but I think the fact that from 2002, 2003 and onwards, the Turkish Cypriot community, mobilized from below, that created a dynamic that really was so powerful, solution now, and also asking Denktaş, this powerful, legendary figure there, to solve the problem now or resign. So the messages were coming to the Greek Cypriots too. However, they were not utilized because of the change of our leadership here, which did not really believe in the bicommunal, bizonal federal solution, but only on this sort of half-truth. If we get into the European Union, we'll get a better solution, or we will Europeanize the problem, and it will be, we will get a better deal. So that misinformation, I think, together with the support of many other institutions, including the church in the Greek Cypriot community, got the result that we got. So this is the other gap, you know, when one community mobilizes, the other is not really there in its a kind of shared agenda for the vision.
Up into and then again up into the 2017 experience, right? That
and 2017, another big.
Can you both help me? So I mean, there's so much more to Cyprus than the conflict. It colors everything, but it's also such a rich and interesting place. And can we move briefly, perhaps, from the focus on the conflict to Cypriot democracy? And it intrigues me, the story that you're telling, because on the one hand, there's this kind of populist leadership, ethno-nationalism that you've introduced to us as a concept, Maria, as a powerful influence here, and yet a multi-party system, and active civil society, and in spite of partition, cross-border, cross-zonal communication and organization, and what's also interesting for us to consider is that 4 years after entry into the EU, the Great Recession breaks out, and Cyprus, the economy is really horribly hit. In effect, the Troika becomes, at least via economic means, a foreign occupying force, controlling the freedom of the Republic of Cyprus to make decisions. Northern Cyprus is left to its own demise and is oriented. And again, you can correct me fully. I accept that. But what's interesting on top of that is that Euroscepticism, the kind of dynamic of rejecting the EU project, doesn't overwhelm the Republic. And as soon as the economy goes a little bit better, we see the numbers, we see a deep commitment to the European project. And so all of what you're describing to me suggests, okay, there's something here, there's a hope for resolution, there's a hope for our, help me out here. What am I describing? How do I understand what I'm trying to describe here? Either of you. Maria, let's start with you.
Okay, just I think James might give a bit a sort of better economic analysis, because yes, we have a democracy in Cyprus, as you described it, you know, with multi-party, but I believe that the Cyprus unresolved conflict colors everything, from the public discourses, okay, to the individual party contestations. And there hasn't really been a maturity in intellectual analysis and thinking about the different social and cultural issues that are also as important as the political issue. You know, the political issue very often is only viewed through the lens of legal aspects, you know, or of numbers, how much territory, how many troops, etc. You know, but it never really went deeper when we talk about property, for instance, when we talk about economy in a future solution, what would it look like, in terms of coexistence, in terms of the European values that we all espouse, supposedly now. And so we haven't built our negotiations on those values as well. So we end up with negotiations that are monologues, and every time there's a deadlock, they blame the other module immediately, shapes the thinking of each other's publics, and the gap widens again until next time. But I think also with regard to the Euroscepticism, yes, at the beginning it was really high. I remember numbers like 76, support and so on. During the 2013 and so on, actually, I was one of the very few who was interviewed in Cyprus, and one was in the Cyprus Mail, that I was supporting the first proposal that came from the EU Commission. And everybody, even my friends from Greece, they were telling me, "You're a traitor, what are you doing? Why?" And so, and then when the haircut came and the worst of all, situations here, I also suffered. And we had Troika in and out. So, this created a very big insecurity in people. And that's when Euroscepticism, I think, started. But gradually it's smoothed out. And of course, with a lot of the EU funding coming for different projects, for infrastructure, and restorations, even of cultural buildings and so on, started, and research. I think where we need a lot more of EU funding is to build the infrastructure for reconciliation, both from below and for linkages with the decision-making level. This we haven't done yet. The two are still very separate. And there is a big gap to this day. Everything is top-down, as I was saying before, let alone the participation of civil society, youth, and women in the peace-building processes in all its totality, from the beginning and the different stages, and having transparency and also accountability. This, I think, is where our democracy still is not that complete. Yeah.
I appreciate that, Maria. I want to turn to James to get his input here, but I really appreciate your attention to these questions of peace and conflict and how you're charting that out. And one of the things that here at the University of Pittsburgh we've been talking about is that alongside peace processes, at this moment we seem to see war processes, that there are interests to maintain war, that it's not one or the other, but both are operating at the same time. And one might say that you're also, in as much as you're pointing to peace process, you're also describing something of a conflict process, and both of you are helping us understand that there are entrenched rationales for maintaining conflict that are at work here, in spite of the other forces at work. But James, could you help extend our understanding of these questions of the economy, the Euroscepticism, and the structure of or the strength, the health of Cypriot democracy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question because, of course, as you know, when one of the first questions that you have to answer as a country that wants to join the European Union is that you are a democratic state. I mean, this is part of this Copenhagen criteria. I mean, you've got functioning free market, you follow liberal democracy, and we know all the problems that we're seeing now. And Cyprus is in a bit of a strange situation because, of course, the constitution broke down in 1963-64, And it was this complex system that was actually about a power balance between the majority Greek Cypriots and the minority in numbers term Turkish Cypriots. Turkish Cypriots get terribly upset when you ever recall them a minority. But that was the reality of it. And then you took away that safeguard. And so one of the complaints that the Turkish Cypriots had, or the leadership, was that Cyprus wasn't a functioning democracy because that important balance in the system had been removed. Interesting enough, Cyprus is the only EU member that actually has a US-style presidential system. There's no other. In fact, there's only two European countries, mainstream European countries, which have a US system, and that's Turkey now as well, that changed its constitution relatively recently. But yes, no, in European terms, the American model isn't considered quite as democratic. But the reality is that
I'm not sure if in American terms at this moment it's considered democratic, but that's a conversation
you know what
have.
we can get into. But it's actually really interesting because it touches on a really important point, which is, and that was very important in the early years of the Republic, is that if you merge that role of head of government and head of state together, then it can lead to abuse. And it can also lead to ethno-national problems in a place like Cyprus, because the first president of Cyprus was somebody called Archbishop Macarius, who was the leader of the Greek Cypriot. And so you had baked into the system the sense that many Turkish Cypriots said, well, we can never be a president of Cyprus. The constitution is set up that the most we can ever aspire to is the vice presidency. And then that was gone. And Cyprus instituted what's called the law of necessity, which said, look, we can't function according to our constitution, so we're going to have to find workarounds to do that. And the EU looked at it and said, even with those workarounds, as far as we're concerned, this is a properly functioning democratic state. And I've always taken pains to point it out. It is incredibly pluralistic. There are shortcomings. Civil society isn't as strong here as people like to think it is. Ironically, it's much, much weaker than Greece. Where Greece is a country I also lived in, and there it's very, very different. It's much more pluralistic at a popular level. But Cyprus, you've got all these different political parties and things, and you have a free press. Never felt that was an issue, that there's freedom of speech. I mean, it really is a functioning democracy. So I just say that. On the economic side, I think, you bring up this really important question about the financial crisis. And I think the point to emphasize there is that, and I'll put it very bluntly, Cyprus's economic crisis was spurred by greed and stupidity. It wasn't like Greece. I lived in Greece. I remember I lived in Greece 2000, 2001. Everyone knew who had any background in economics that this was an economy that was utterly, utterly unsustainable, that its pension system, it was heading to bankrupt. The problem was every time somebody suggested trying to reform it, you'd have protests, demonstrations, riots, the government would back down. And so this was a problem that was just getting worse and worse and worse. And that eventually led to the crisis in Greece. The problem for Cyprus is that Cyprus is actually a very well-run country in many ways, and it was economically far more stable and far more structured, but it saw the collapse in Greece as an opportunity to jump in. And people here, whether because they thought they could take advantage of the opportunity or they wanted to help out their brethren in Greece. I mean, there's a complex relationship that maybe Maria can talk to about that. As a Greek Cypriot, talking about that complex relationship. So Cyprus jumped in and paid a very heavy price for trying to essentially either bail out Greece or make a buck off Greece. And that's what essentially brought the economy down. It overextended itself into Greece.
Interesting.
But it meant that it could bounce back a lot more quickly. So the IMF came in, but it was in and out relatively quickly. And, you look at Cyprus today, I mean, there are issues, and that's one thing I'll mention in just a second. But essentially, it was the crisis that we saw here was of a very, very different type to the one that we saw in Greece. It wasn't the structural problem. It was something, completely different. The one thing I would say, which I think is important in all of this debate, is that sometimes one could make the argument that Cyprus was perhaps a victim in the longer term of its own economic and political success. And by that, I mean that whereas you had the Eastern European countries, which were essentially economically and politically leveled at the end of the Cold War, they were flattened and had to rebuild. Cyprus didn't have to make as many changes as many of these countries. And so one gets the sense that as advanced as Cyprus is, that it's perhaps missed that opportunity to take advantage of modernization that we've seen in certain other EU member states. I mean, it's a highly, anyone, you know, and I will fly the flag of Cyprus and say, come and visit the island if you haven't had the opportunity. It's a fascinating place to be.
Yes.
And it's a wonderful place to live, as we'll both attest. But you can also see the shortcomings that, you know, there hasn't been opportunities taken to modernize in certain areas that might have been available had it not been quite as successful in that EU process, that if it had to go back and start almost from scratch, as some of these other countries have done.
Interesting. Which areas, for instance?
Well, I mean, you know, so we talk about political modernization. I think, you know,
I see.
You have a sense that, you know, that there is more that could have been done in that. But I think Maria would be really interesting to talk to about this. But on the other hand, you also see certain trends here which are worrying in a way that we're seeing trends elsewhere in Europe and even in obviously in the United States, which is the rise of not just the right, but the far right, which, you know, even a place like Cyprus isn't immune to that, even though it's a very small society. Elements of, you know, people will call it corruption. I've always pushed back against. Cyprus is a very small place. You know, people know each other. And so you know, but there are still elements that you could see that things could be done, which are very difficult to get through because you've got very entrenched interests that, you know, in a small place, it's hard to push back against them in a way that maybe in bigger countries you can.
Right. Yeah. That annoying uncle at the table that you're not going to be able to fight with over the holidays. But no, it's interesting. Ingrid's going to point out that our time is coming to an end, and there are so many things that I wanted to ask about. And just, Maria, one of the things is Cyprus is not in the Schengen zone. Cyprus is nevertheless exposed to migration, and I'm wondering, just it's such an important topic at this moment, and in the configuration that we're talking about, the political and the economic, and then Cyprus being in the Mediterranean and being near the zones, the movement patterns of migrants. Could you say something about the impact of migration and being inside or outside the Schengen zone on Cyprus?
I think one of the impact has been the exploitation that the extreme right and anti-migrant groups have used to promote both their agenda, and also the second is the rise in racism, you know, and racist also very often hate speech against the other who is taking our jobs, etc.
Right.
But there has also been an acknowledgement that Cyprus has been receiving more refugees, more you know, asylum seekers and migrants than other European states vis-a-vis our population ratio. And I think this has been discussed a number of times in the European Commission, and I think things are sort of a little bit better these days because there is more public discussion about it. And I think more views are also from the other side that these migrants here contribute to the local economy, contribute to many other aspects, you know, that the extreme right always tries, you know, to either marginalize or ignore completely and focus on one aspect, what would happen to our local identity and how would this change our demographics and so on. So this is, I think, an issue that we need to work on much more. And finally, with regard to the political modernization and political party cultures, I would really say the aspect where we want to work on a lot is the party clientelistic culture. You know, who you know, what, you get the job. Who you don't know, you are completely excluded despite your you know, qualifications and so on. So this is something that we also need to work on much more with regard to democratic processes and individual rights.
I can't thank both of you enough. I mean, this is just a fascinating conversation. And I feel like at this particular moment, when we're looking over to Israel, Gaza, when we're looking at Ireland and Northern Ireland, when we're looking at Ukraine, that the insights that you're providing from Cyprus are reminders, I wish we could say the hope of Cyprus, but here the insights that you have help us think more complexly about the world that we live in. And I'm thinking that I would love to have you back because one of the things that's also of interest to me is the way that we were talking about accession and expansion, enlargement, but there was also this moment of the Euro-Mediterranean project, the European neighborhood policy, and this attempt to think of the Mediterranean as a whole region, and with Cyprus as a part of that, and that is a really interesting project, in part because it led to liberalization on the southern side of the Mediterranean that displaced people and has fed the kind of economic flows and interests and displacement and the Arab Spring and all of these things are all interconnected in a way that such wonderful colleagues could help us parse out in their details in a future conversation. So with that, I'm going to thank both of you for really making us all want to go to Nicosia and say hello to you in person. Yeah.
Yes, you're welcome. Please, anytime.
Thank you. Thank you.